Welcome to Caritas Querens. In this series, we're taking a look at the topic of free will, and specifically at several arguments that are brought against apokatastasis or Christian universalism from the Christian free will perspective. In this video, I'd like to take a look at the idea of free will and responsibility, and more specifically for our responsibility for our free will, the responsibility for our free will acts. And so one of the premises that is often out there when it comes to arguing from a free will perspective is that we are created with free will. That's something good. That's something, in fact, an eminently good thing that God has given to us, part and parcel of what it means to be human, and in fact, maybe the most defining feature and the highest feature of what it means to be human. And therefore, God has to respect that and respect all of our decisions. But at the same time, the flip side of that is that we are eminently, almost an absolute sense, responsible for the decisions we make. And so you get this sense that you get the sense of a God who wants desperately to save us, but his hands are tied. In fact, he has tied his own hands by creating us with free will. And so he therefore has to respect our free will. At the same time, he also has to hold us accountable and has to respect the responsibility we have for our free will. Okay? Here's my concern about that. Okay, by creating us with free will, I think it's legitimate to say that God himself actually has some responsibility for the decisions we make by creating us with free will. He has given us this tremendous power, and by gifting us with that power, he also has some responsibility in bestowing that power on us, right? I mean, as a parent, this just seems obvious to me. I would never hand my 2-year-old a loaded gun. Why? Is it because I'm totally opposed to guns? Or no, I think there's legitimate uses for guns, but because I know that that is a tremendous power, and my 2-year-old just doesn't have the ability to wield that power responsibly and carefully and safely. And so by giving them that tremendous power, I would be taking on the responsibility, at least in part, myself. In fact, I would say if I give it to a 2-year-old, I'd really be totally responsible because they just don't have the ability to take any responsibility for it, any significant responsibility. So if my 2-year-old shot somebody or shot himself, I would hold myself entirely responsible. Now, think about it. The power that God has given us in the arguments from the free will perspective, the power that he's given us is basically this ultimate power that he himself cannot intervene in, cannot contradict, or cannot override. And it is the power that ultimately determines our destiny. Ultimately, people who argue from the free will perspective would say things like, even the souls in hell, they choose to be there, and they choose to be there forever. I'm sure you've heard descriptions like this, that even if God were to go down into hell himself, if Christ were to go down into hell and say, okay, I'm going to give you a second chance. If you want, you can follow me now. You get a get out of hell free card. That the souls in hell would all unanimously say, no, I want to stay here. And even if he did that 1,000,000 times or infinitely, if he went down every day, so to speak, they would every time they would reject it. They would say, no, I want to stay here. Okay? What a tremendous power. So by giving us that tremendous power, isn't God in some way responsible for the decisions and the actions that we do with that power? Now consider especially when you look at our human experience, what it's like. I mean, I think to a certain extent, when you look at a human life wielding the power of free will, which basically is determining his own eternal destiny, in my opinion, that's on par with, in fact, I would say it's even greater a responsibility than me handing my 2-year-old a gun, a loaded gun, because ultimately the consequences are far greater, infinitely greater, and I would argue that in some ways, our human experience and our capacity to wield that power appropriately are really not a whole lot different from the experience and the capacity of a 2-year-old to wield a loaded gun appropriately. We come into this world with minds that are darkened, with wills that are weakened. We come into this world that's full of corruption, where it's hard to find the truth, where it's hard to find good models of what's right and wrong, of good morality. We come into this world oftentimes at tender ages being abused or being mistreated, oftentimes not even on purpose. It's hard being a parent, and oftentimes parents screw up, right? And it has consequences on their children. We come into this world where we are we are influenced in so many ways by nature and nurture, by our upbringing and by the world around us, oftentimes in so many negative ways. And it's hard to really find or take everybody responsible for those things. So, I want to say that it's almost like maybe the analogy of a loaded gun is not the best analogy. Sometimes in the past I've said that it's almost like God hands us a gun and forces us to play Russian roulette or something like that. But I don't think that's the best example. I think maybe it would be better to say that it's almost like God says, okay, I'm going to give you free will, and you're gonna prove yourself by completing this Rubik's cube. Okay, but let's just assume that instead of a simple Rubik's cube, it's not like a 3 by 3 Rubik's cube, but it's like a 3 million by 3 million Rubik's cube. Okay, much more complex, which I think human life is, right. And not only that, but while we're trying to figure it out, oftentimes things get in the way. People bump us. People knock it out of our hands. People, excuse me, or we learn things wrong. We get colors wrong because people teach us wrong, or we don't hold it right. All kinds of things get in the way that keep us from completing our task, from completing our destiny. It seems to me that there's something kind of, I don't know, kind of unfair about seeing it that way. And honestly, I think it's in some ways much more attractive to see the alternative to the free will model, which tends to be basically a sort of predestinarian model, the assumption that ultimately God chooses some people before they're even born, and he gives them the grace they need to get to heaven, and others he either positively condemns them to hell, or he at least permits them to go to hell. In my mind, that's a lot easier to see in regard to the world we live in and in regard to human experience, because oftentimes there do seem to be people who are in just terrible circumstances, and something brings them out of them, something shakes them out of it. And why that person and not others? It seems hard to escape the reality of grace, and the reality that it may be that God is choosing to give them some grace that he doesn't give to other people. I'm not saying I embrace that model. I don't fully. But I have to say, it seems in some ways a lot more attractive than the free will model, which basically says, God says, here you go, here's this tremendous power, free will. I'm going to put you out into a world that's awful, that's horrible, that's full of darkness and sin and corruption, and good luck. Do the best you can. That doesn't seem fair at all. And I think really God comes out looking like a very bad father in that regard. I know that one of the pieces of advice I got early on as a father was from a good friend of mine who said, one of the most important things you can do as a father is to keep your children innocent, protect them from a lot of the bad stuff that's out there. He said, you can't shelter them forever, but you have to find a nice balance between exposing them to all the bad stuff right from the get-go and gradually kind of introducing them to it. And I've seen that as a great challenge, but also a very wise piece of advice. But it doesn't seem like that's the way that God does things according to the free will model. So, in my opinion, that again, the free will model seems to imply that God takes no responsibility for giving us this tremendous power of free will, and yet he holds us strictly, rigorously accountable for our decisions. And if you assume that some people go to hell and never experience full union with God, that's a little bit frightening. Again, I think that God comes out looking like, at the very least, sort of a negligent father. On the other hand, if we assume apokatastasis, well, then the picture becomes very different. Because then we know that certainly life is screwy, life is a mess, but we know that God ultimately has our good in mind and our salvation in mind, and he assures us that he will bring us into full union with Him. And so now free will doesn't seem to be such a daunting, such a tremendous power. It is certainly a tremendous power. It is certainly something that we aren't to toy with or treat lightly. But at the same time, it becomes something that we can use. And if we misuse it sometimes or abuse it sometimes, we don't need to worry. We don't need to think that all is lost because God will ultimately find a way out of it. God will ultimately help us. It kind of reminds me of there's a story I heard one time, an anecdote about a great pianist, and I don't remember who it was now, but he was performing in concert, and all of a sudden, a child came walking up onto the stage and just sat down and started tapping out chopsticks or something on the piano. And everybody gasped, like, "Oh, what's going to happen?" And the pianist didn't grow angry. He just sat down next to the boy, and he started just spontaneously accompanying him on the piano. And that simple little tune of chopsticks that the boy was pounding out or tapping out, probably very imperfectly, suddenly became very beautiful in conjunction with or in cooperation with the playing of the great pianist. And in my mind, that's what free will looks like in a universalist perspective. We go out there, and oftentimes our exercise of free will, at its best, looks like just tapping out chopsticks on a grand piano. But then ultimately, we're not doing it alone. Our free will is in line with God's freedom, with God's will for us, which is love, which is our salvation, which is our sanctification. And so ultimately, even that weak, that slight, that oftentimes deficient free will that we exercise comes out sounding absolutely beautiful in union with God. So that's my argument about that. If you are finding this useful, edifying, interesting at all, I'd appreciate if you would like and subscribe. And please share with others that you think might enjoy watching this video. And again, if you have any comments, any positive, negative, want to share your experiences, your thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. So please put them in the comment box below. I do try to read them all and respond to them all in a timely manner, so I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, adios.